I am called Marable Cross, and at the time all of this unfolded, I was in my early 40s, standing in a crowded banquet hall decorated with white drapes, glittering lights, and gold ribbons to celebrate what was supposed to be a joyful milestone for my parents, a marriage anniversary that marked more than 4 decades together. Yet that evening became the moment I realized how deeply cruelty can hide behind polite smiles and raised glasses, because my daughter, Leela, who had just turned 11, sat quietly at a small table near the wall with other children, while the adults laughed loudly and praised one child over another, and she tried so desperately to shrink herself into the background as if hoping she could disappear, while my niece, Celeste, the same age but praised endlessly, soaked up every compliment like sunlight, the contrast between them so obvious that it felt deliberate, because Celeste was the child everyone admired, the one who collected trophies, perfect scores, and piano awards, while Leela was the one people whispered about when they thought I could not hear, the one they called slow, the one they assumed would never amount to much. And although they never used those words openly before that night, I had always sensed the judgment hanging in the air, waiting for a moment when it would finally be spoken out loud. Leela was different in ways that had nothing to do with intelligence, yet everything to do with how her mind worked, because she had been diagnosed years earlier with a learning difference that made letters twist and words slide across the page, turning reading into a daily mountain she had to climb with scraped knees and aching muscles. But instead of giving up, she fought harder than anyone I had ever known, spending hours practicing, rereading, sounding out, crying when the words refused to stay still, then wiping her face and trying again, while my parents dismissed her struggle as laziness or lack of effort, saying she simply needed to concentrate more, as if a lifetime of neurological wiring could be undone by sheer willpower. And every time they compared her to Celeste, who could read novels before most children learned cursive, I saw Leela's shoulders slump a little lower, her eyes fill with a sadness far too heavy for a child, yet she never stopped trying. Never stopped hoping that one day someone would see her the way I did. The night of the celebration, my mother tapped her glass with a spoon and smiled as the room fell quiet, her voice floating above the crowd as she thanked everyone for attending and spoke of love, tradition, and family, then announced that she and my father had decided to reveal a special decision they believed would honor their legacy. And as my father rose from his chair, I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine because I already sensed what was coming. And when he looked directly at Celeste with pride shining in his eyes, I knew my fear was justified, because he declared that she would inherit their home and a large trust they had established, praising her brilliance and calling her the future of the family. And as applause filled the room, I glanced at Leela, whose lips trembled as she stared down at her plate, trying not to cry while everyone celebrated someone else's worth as if it were a measurable currency she did not possess. But the cruelty did not stop with favoritism, because my mother continued speaking, turning her gaze toward Leela with a tight smile, saying that while she loved both grandchildren, only one had shown true potential, and that not everyone was meant for greatness, implying that some were destined for simpler lives. And then my father, emboldened by the moment, added the words that shattered everything, calling my daughter the foolish one, saying she would never need such responsibility because she would never understand it anyway. And in that instant, time froze as I watched Leela push her chair back and run from the room, her small shoulders shaking as her sobs echoed down the hallway, while my sister grabbed my arm and whispered that I should not embarrass the family, as if dignity were something my child had just lost. I stepped forward before fear could stop me, feeling the weight of every judgment, every insult, every silent dismissal my daughter had endured over the years. And when I struck a fork against a glass, the sound cut through the chatter like a blade, drawing every eye toward me, and I spoke calmly despite the storm in my chest, telling everyone exactly what had just happened, that my child had been labeled worthless in front of dozens of witnesses, and then I revealed what no one had bothered to ask: that Leela had entered a national science challenge and built a working water purification system using recycled materials, ranking among thousands of competitors from across the country, and that she had written poetry so profound it had been accepted into multiple youth journals. And as I held up proof on my phone, I watched my parents' faces drain of color, their pride dissolving into shock. I told them that dyslexia was not stupidity, that it was simply a different way of processing the world, and that brilliance did not always wear the same costume. And when my mother tried to excuse herself by claiming ignorance, I reminded her that ignorance is a choice when curiosity is ignored, because they never asked, never listened, never tried to understand. And I made it clear that money could not repair the damage they had done, that respect and belief were what my daughter deserved. Not inheritance chosen by favoritism. And as I took Leela's hand and led her away from the stunned room, I felt both heartbreak and relief, knowing that this confrontation, though painful, had finally spoken the truth aloud. Long before that night, when Leela was barely 6, a school meeting had introduced me to the reality of her learning struggles, with teachers explaining that she was falling behind in reading, that her brain rearranged letters and reversed words, making textbooks feel like coded messages meant to defeat her. And although the diagnosis frightened me, it also gave me clarity, pushing me to seek tutors, specialists, and every resource I could find, even when it drained my savings and my energy. Because I refused to let her be defined by something she could not control, yet my parents brushed off every explanation, calling it an excuse, insisting that she simply lacked ability, and eventually I stopped trying to convince them, realizing they had already decided who she was without ever seeing who she could become. Meanwhile, every family gathering became a stage for Celeste's achievements, with endless stories about competitions, awards, and future ambitions, while Leela sat quietly, absorbing the unspoken message that she was less, until one evening she asked me if she was stupid, repeating words she had heard from someone who should have protected her. And that moment ignited a fire in me, because I understood that silence was no longer an option, and though I confronted my parents, they insisted they were being realistic, not cruel, as if realism justified cruelty. And from that day forward, I promised myself that Leela would never face this world alone. With time, determination, and countless hours of practice, Leela slowly transformed her struggles into strengths, discovering a passion for environmental science that gave her purpose beyond grades and labels. And when she decided to build something meaningful to help others, I watched her spend months researching, failing, rebuilding, and learning, until her project finally worked, proving not only her intelligence but her resilience. And when recognition came, I chose to protect her joy rather than expose it to dismissive voices, waiting until the truth could no longer be ignored. The invitation from a world-renowned science institute arrived like a whisper of destiny, offering her a chance to join a program for young innovators. And when she doubted herself, repeating the cruel words she had been taught to believe, I reminded her that brilliance is not measured by ease, but by effort. And as we submitted her application together, I knew that no inheritance could compare to the confidence she was finally beginning to build, even as my parents prepared their announcement, unaware that the child they dismissed was already rising far beyond their expectations. That night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, because as we drove away, leaving behind applause and judgment, I realized that my daughter's future would not be shaped by those who failed to see her worth, but by her courage, her creativity, and the unwavering belief that she is extraordinary, not despite her differences, but because of them. The days following that night felt unreal, as though the world had tilted on its axis, and nothing quite fit the way it used to. Because my phone vibrated endlessly with missed calls and messages from relatives who claimed they had never intended harm, insisting that everything had been misunderstood. Yet none of them asked how Leela felt. None of them wondered what it was like to have your worth publicly reduced to a cruel word. And as I listened to her move quietly through our apartment, her footsteps soft and careful as if she were afraid of taking up space, I realized that healing would not come from apologies spoken too late, but from showing her through actions that her life held infinite possibility, even if that meant building a future without the approval of those who should have supported her from the beginning. One evening, as we sat on the floor surrounded by notebooks, science sketches, and half-finished poems, Leela looked up at me with eyes still clouded by doubt and whispered that she had already received an email confirming her acceptance into the summer program she had applied for, a place where students were chosen for curiosity and innovation rather than test scores. And as she said it, her voice trembled with both excitement and fear, because part of her still believed the old labels. still feared that she would be discovered as an imposter, and I held her close, reminding her that opportunity had come not by accident, but because she had earned it through persistence, imagination, and a courage far greater than she realized. When she left for the program weeks later, stepping into a world filled with young minds who shared her passion for discovery, she called me each night, describing laboratories, mentors, and friendships that made her feel seen for the first time. And with every conversation, I heard her confidence grow, her words stronger, her laughter freer, as if a weight she had carried for years was finally being lifted. And in those moments, I understood that true success is not measured by what we inherit, but by what we overcome and the light we learn to carry within ourselves. My parents eventually came to my door, their faces worn with regret, holding revised documents and promises of fairness. Yet when they offered to divide everything equally, I returned the papers, explaining that respect could not be purchased, that trust must be rebuilt through understanding and time, and that Leela needed something far more valuable than money, which was the certainty that she was loved for who she was, not for how closely she matched someone else's achievements. And though they cried and pleaded, I stood firm, knowing that protecting my daughter's spirit mattered more than any legacy they could offer. Slowly, they began learning, attending workshops, reading about learning differences, and acknowledging the harm they had caused. And while their efforts were only the first step, they were necessary, because change requires humility, and humility begins with admitting fault. And though forgiveness may one day come, it will arrive on Leela's timeline, not theirs, because healing cannot be rushed or demanded, only nurtured with patience and sincerity. As months passed, Leela's creativity flourished, her poems evolving into reflections of resilience and hope, her science projects growing bolder and more innovative. And watching her transform reminded me that children do not need perfection from adults, only belief, because belief becomes the soil where confidence grows, and once rooted, it can withstand even the harshest storms of doubt. There were still difficult days when frustration returned, when words blurred and assignments felt overwhelming. But now she faced them with determination rather than shame, understanding that challenges did not define her limits, but revealed her strength. And in those moments, I saw not a child burdened by labels, but a young visionary shaping her own narrative with courage and grace. The world may continue to misunderstand those who think differently, but through Leela, I learned that difference is not a weakness, but a doorway to perspectives others may never see, and that every child deserves to be recognized not for how closely they follow a path, but for how bravely they create one of their own, guided by curiosity, compassion, and resilience. Our story is not about inheritance or approval, but about reclaiming dignity, about standing against silence, and about choosing love over judgment. Because when we protect those who cannot yet protect themselves, we plant seeds of strength that will one day grow into forests of confidence, shading future generations from the same storms we once endured. And as I watch Leela chase her dreams with fearless determination, I know that no matter where her journey leads, she will always carry within her the truth she fought so hard to believe, that she is brilliant, worthy, and destined for a life shaped not by others' limitations, but by her own boundless potential.